Ms. Brauckmann has an interest in archaeology and history from a young age and began working with the Fairfield Foundation as a senior in high school. Since graduation from James Madison University in 2019, she's continued working with Fairfield and has led the field excavations here at Christ Church for the last year and a half. The excavations have uncovered features and artifacts relating to the current circa 1735 church and the circa 1670 church and a Native American encampment which predates both structures. Katie.
I have a microphone over here, so I'll stand on this side, you can hear me. So yeah, we're going to talk to you guys today about the excavations we've been conducting essentially all the way around the foundation of the current church, as well as several drain lines extending away through the churchyard. Found lots and lots of material. And if you guys are interested, I have some of the artifacts that are, they're going to be up on the slide for the most part. If you want to see them in person, I have them up here as well for afterwards, and we can take a walk out to where we have, we're still finishing up the last corner of the building, so we can take a walk out there and see the current excavations if anyone is interested. So yeah, we can kind of get into it. So I don't really need to go too deep into the historical background of the church for you guys, but kind of do that really quickly first. I'll talk a little bit about the archaeology and why we're digging, where we're digging, and then kind of talk about what we found starting at the beginning essentially, and kind of working our way to the present day. So as you guys know, before either church was here, the Native Americans that were living on this land, there was the Rappahannock tribe in this area. Specifically, I think I have, no I do not have a picture. Specifically, there was a large village site labeled on the 1606 John Smith map as Katattawoman. And so that is likely, and there's also several smaller settlements kind of going up the Rappahannock River. So the site that we have here is not necessarily one of those large villages, but it's probably a smaller encampment-related, seasonal occupation related to one of those larger village sites. In the 1650s, John Carter patents this area and buys other tracts in the area, and probably doesn't settle here immediately. There was some trouble removing the Native Americans who were here. They had to, he actually got an extension on some of his patents to, you had to settle the area within a certain number of years, and he got an extension on some of these patents because they were having so much trouble settling the land because of resistance, essentially. But they were here by the 1660s, and in 1666, the vestry was formed that ordered the first church to be built, and that was completed in 1670. That is used for 60 years, 50 or 60 years. And by the 1720s, it was probably becoming, a little rundown. Virginia weather not kind to wood structures, which is probably a wooden church. And so 1735 or 1730s, the first church is built, and that's completed 1735. In the 1800s, due to a variety of factors, use of the church was more intermittent. There was the American Revolution, so the Church of England wasn't so popular after that, as you can imagine. And so there was other denominations were becoming more popular, such as the Methodists and others, as well as other factors that kind of, the church started to fall into disrepair. And there were several renovations that took place. For example, in the 1830s, a new roof was put on, replacing old wooden roof with a new wooden roof. But it isn't really until the 1890s that we see a lot of material begin from renovations in that period. And we can tell it's from the 1890s and afterwards because it has slate. And so the current slate roof was put on in 1897, and that so that's a good key indicator for us. And we have something that's from 1897 or later. So essentially it's the 20th century renovation period. So we have been excavating mostly around the foundation. We are excavating ahead of the installation of the drain line. So water issues within the church, the water is wicking up, and when it evaporates out, it's eroding the mortar. Freeze-thaw cycles can damage the bricks when it's that wet. So ahead of that drain system, we are essentially doing the excavation to see if we can see what we can find, and we're especially interested in trying to identify any burials that could be impacted, because we want to make sure we can, for the most part, try to avoid those if we can. So each of these kind of squares you see, the area is kind of divided up like a brownie, brownie tin into individual squares. Each one of those squares gets a number, and so that's how we know exactly where every artifact we find comes from. It gets put into a bag, it's labeled with that number, as well as that layer. So as we're going down, we're looking for not just the artifacts, but the soil color as it changes tells us a lot of information. So different soil colors are indicative of different events that happen. So if they are bringing in a bunch of fill to try to level out a low spot, that's going to be a different color and a different texture than the dirt around it. So you can kind of see this area here is kind of like, it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but this orange color kind of going up there, that's one layer dating, in that case, the 1990s, when they were installing the brick splash and consequently taking it out when it didn't quite work. So that's kind of the sort of things we're looking for. And then, so whenever in the past they would dig through all of those layers, all that dirt gets churned up. When they put it back into the hole, it essentially goes back in as a different color. And so we're looking for these different colors to indicate essentially where things happened in the past. So this square on the left is where they dug for a post hole. You can see the yellow square is where they would have dug the hole. And then this is, that's where they took out the post itself. So that's kind of when it's, and we call those features. And so whenever I say feature, I'm usually talking about either a post hole or a burial on this site where they dug a hole in the past and filled it back in. So the picture on the right actually has a row of burials. You can see the yellow rectangles kind of going left to right across that picture. So that's a row of mostly unmarked burials.
What corner of the church is that?
So this is the northeast corner. Yeah, so the first one we started on, kind of see, wait now. Fortunately, laser pointer doesn't work on the screen, but there's one rectangle here, and they just kind of go down another row. A nice clear one up there as well. So that's what we're looking for, in addition to the artifacts.
We just buried people that close to the church.
Yeah, usually starting about 5 feet off from the building. Seems like to be a pretty standard. Some of them are a little bit closer, but that seems to be, at least in the 18th century, I think, being close to the church, it was considered, we wanted to be closer to the kind of, God, holy symbols, that kind of thing. Especially a lot of the burials we've had are around the altar, so I think that kind of plays into it as well. But the artifacts are certainly something that we're interested in. They are especially useful because they help us date those different layers and help us tell what kinds of activities were happening. So for example, this is a kind of mug or tankard that we found kind of crushed in place. So starts to raise questions about like what kind of activities people are doing in the churchyard. You don't think of it as being a big place where people are doing a lot of cooking or eating, but obviously someone was doing something of that nature here. And then also probably the number one artifact we found that's not from either church has been tobacco smoking pipes. And so these are two different tobacco smoking pipes, kind of looking at them down the center. So they kind of look like beads right now, but they're essentially this one. So looking at it kind of down, looking at the bore. And you can see they're different sizes. So the bore diameter changes over time. So the tobacco pipes are really interesting to find because you can use that to help date when it was dropped or when it was made, as the bore diameter gets smaller over time. So the artifacts, and especially where we find the artifacts, is really important as well. But then, so for every hour of work we do excavating something in the field, it usually takes 2 to 3 more to process it fully in the lab. So everything we excavate comes back to our lab space in Gloucester. We wash it off with toothbrushes, and then we catalog everything into a database that we'll use to interpret the final report when all is said and done. And this part especially is still underway, so a lot of these things I'm going to be telling you about are kind of preliminary interpretations. Well, I'm really excited to do the kind of final maps and everything, and concentration maps and such when we get everything washed and cataloged back in the lab. Oh, there it is. So as I mentioned, the John Smith map, 1606. So kind of getting into, now we can start talking about the things we're finding. So 1606, he describes the Catutta woman as this large village site nearby. And as you can see, so the map is oriented a little bit differently. The north is this way. So this would be the Chesapeake Bay with the Rappahannock River going up. And there's several other smaller villages going up the Rappahannock, you can see. So several of these could have been who was occupying the temporary camp that we think we have here. And so the evidence of the Native American encampment that we have is by and large ceramics. So pots and things that were broken, and we just find the little pieces of them. So a lot of these have really interesting surface treatments as well. So the two cord marked pieces you see there would have been taking essentially cord or twine and either, and in this case we think they were wrapping it around a dowel and essentially pressing that into the clay to make these marks. We have net and pressed, which is exactly as it sounds. They were taking a net of some kind and pressing it into the clay. And then inside just using a stylus, like a reed or something, and creating these lines. So these are very exciting to find. A lot of the pieces we have are actually decorated, which is kind of interesting and helps us date it a little bit. And in particular, some of the pieces we have are very dateable. So this one is what we call Potomac Creek ware, and that just is named for the river that it was first identified in. And it dates to about 1200 to 1700, and this is several pieces of a large vessel that have this really intricate design. It's a little hard to see on the photograph up here, but it's kind of like hatch mark, zigzag design along the top. It's really, really interesting and very rare to find that many pieces that all go together like that. So, and also, like I said, very useful for us to be able to date when it was made. And the other thing is, I don't have a picture of it here, but we do have some projectile points, so arrowheads or the little flakes of stone that break off when they were making them. And so some of these actually might be a little bit older. So for example, this one we were wondering, it's a broken piece, so it's hard to tell. We don't have the whole arrowhead, but it could be even older. So archaic period going back even 1,000, 2,000 years before these ceramics were made. So that's something we're still kind of exploring the possibility of. But then we get into the 1600s with the 1670 church. So the things that we're looking to answer with the artifacts from this church is, namely, where is it? There's been some suggestions before. Previous archaeology in the property has tried to identify where this first church was, but because it wasn't likely a brick church. It likely was made of wood, so it either had posts set in the ground, which would leave a soil stain like you saw earlier, or could have even just been a sill that was sitting directly on the ground. Makes it very hard to find archaeologically. But we do find bits and pieces of it, so I'll talk about those in a second, as well as some of the artifacts we think were dropped by the people who were using this church. So the number one thing from the first church I think we find is red clay floor tile. So it's these 10 by 10 inch squares for the most part, of about this thick. So this is one piece we found, and we were really excited about this one. It was one of the first ones we had found on this site at our excavations. But then we got around the foundation and found even more pieces, including these several fragments that mended into almost whole tiles. So that was really interesting to find. And there was a ton of these, mostly in the northeast corner. And I'll show that in a map in a second. But that's was really, really intriguing to us, because being able to map out where these were found might help narrow down a little bit more about where that first church may be. The other artifacts we have from this first church is window glass. So the current church has that kind of clear, maybe with the blue or green tint to it. But then from this first church, we get the casement window glass, which is this olive green. It would have been diamond-shaped panes. When Dave and Thane, who I work for, they did the previous archaeology here in 2006, actually found one or two of these panes crushed in place and were ever actually able to mend them. So that's how we know they likely had this diamond-shaped pane. So this is just a picture, kind of an example of what that would look like with these panes called quarrels that were held in place with window lead. So again, finding these kinds of artifacts and plotting out where they were found is really going to help us narrow down where we think that first church could be, especially in conjunction with that previous archaeology. So another really interesting feature that's not necessarily the church itself, but we think is related to it, is a ditch which doesn't sound that exciting on the surface, but we think it's a 17th century ditch feature. It's very large. It's 4 or 5 feet across, 3 or 4 feet deep, and we found it in 4 separate locations as we were digging. So right along that west sidewalk, as you're entering from the west, we found it on either side of that. We found it in the trench that goes a little bit further south beyond that, and then we actually found it outside the current churchyard wall by one of the sidewalks between us and the church where we are now. So, and that's a span of over 100 feet. So very long, very deep, and very wide. And it seems like they filled it in when they were building the 1735 church. So this likely represented the western boundary of that first churchyard. So it's not necessarily the church itself, but it might help us narrow down exactly where it was. And since churchyards had to be paled in or enclosed by law, this kind of helps us confirm its presence nearby at least. So. But besides the building itself, we find lots and lots of tobacco pipes of this period. So we have both the red clay variety, which is made here in the Chesapeake, almost entirely from the 1600s. And then we also have some of the white clay variety, which was imported from England and sometimes Holland. But in this case, I think we probably mostly have English pipes. And for example, we have one that has a mark, a maker's mark on it, and that mark belongs to Robert Tippett. And so unfortunately there was lots of Robert Tippett, several generations, but ours is likely pre-1740, likely even earlier, so definitely related to the first church. But I find the Chesapeake pipes super, super interesting, especially because there are only a handful of identified makers. There's not a lot of historical record about these, who was making these pipes. But through archaeology, a couple have been identified. And so this one is they call the Nominee maker because they operated up by Nominee Hall, which is only about 20 miles from here as the crow flies. So it's certainly the closest maker, and they seem to use this open circle stamp quite often. So the one on the left is the pieces we have, and the 3 photos on the right are pipes that are attributed to the Nominee maker. So we're kind of maybe starting to get some ideas of trade and people traveling to the church maybe from this area that are bringing these pipes, and then they're breaking or dropping them in the churchyard. So this is just kind of a summary of initial interpretations on where we're finding these things. So we have lots and lots of these early pipes in the northwest corner on the upper left. Lots and lots of tiled window glass has been popping out of the northeast, although we've had scatterings everywhere, just about everywhere we've looked. But those really big pieces are from that upper right-hand corner. That boundary ditch again on the west side. And then we also have a couple of post holes that we're not quite sure what they might go to, also in that northeast corner. So we're still kind of investigating those and excavating those in order to try to tell what they might be. But something to keep in mind. So and then as we move into the 1730s, we have the most material we have is related to the current church, as you might expect. Lots and lots of brick and mortar, a lot of construction related stuff. We have some evidence potentially of the builders of the church, so both the enslaved and the indentured servants who we know were working on the building. We think we might have like some tobacco pipes and things that were dropped by them. We have lots of personal items that were likely dropped by the people, the parishioners who were coming to the church. Lots of renovation era material, so those 1890s and beyond. And the last thing I'll talk about related to this church in a little bit is the burials. So we've excavated one burial so far. For the most part, our main goal is to just identify and leave in place. We're just seeing the tops of the grave shafts, so just the hole that they dug essentially to bury them in. We're not actually seeing any bone for the most part, except for that one that we intentionally excavated. But I'll talk about those in a little bit. And there won't be any pictures of human remains in this slideshow if anyone's concerned about that, both like for you guys and also, you know, for their this individual privacy. But I will talk about them as much as we know so far. There we go. So the first thing they had to do when they were building the church was to dig the foundation. So in this foundation, because it's such a substantial brick building, is also very substantial. It goes down about 4 feet from the ground surface at the time and about 5 feet from where the ground surface is currently. So it's a very large ditch essentially that they dug, and they filled in the brick, built up the foundation and filled in around it to give it extra stability. So I'm essentially standing in the bottom in that photo, standing in the bottom of that, the builder's trench, we call it, for the foundation. And we,
Foundation made of?
so the foundation is brick all the way down.
That part that had to be filled in?
It's just the dirt. They put the dirt back in around it, the clay, really packed it in there. It's a very on this site, when you get down pretty deep, it's a very stiff, gross clay, and so that when they pack that around there, it gives it that extra stability. And we have a bit of a mystery from the foundation. We have this red dust that we found in multiple locations, and we're not exactly sure what it is. We have two possibilities. One is that it could be dust essentially from when they were rubbing the bricks around the door surrounds, the doors and windows. They would have created a bunch of essentially dust debris that got dumped to the builder's trench. Or it could be, we were thinking maybe red wash pigment. So Carl Lounsbury had done a study that they did red wash this building at some point. And so this could be extra pigment that didn't quite get made right, something went wrong, and they essentially just dumped it in the trench essentially. So we're still trying to figure out that particular mystery, but it'd be very cool if it was red wash. That's what I got my fingers crossed for. The other thing we find related to the construction of the building is scaffolding posts. So as they continue to build up the foundation, they would have had to have wooden scaffolding all around the building to construct it. And so we're essentially seeing the post holes that they dug to build the scaffolding, the support posts. And so you can see these little red circles every 10 feet or so, 10 to 15 feet. They're 15 feet out, or sorry, 5 feet out from the building. And they go around the entire foundation. So the map on the right shows essentially the red dots are where we have scaffolding posts, and the yellow dots are where there should be scaffolding posts, but there's a burial or something there that wiped them out. So that's very, very cool to see. They're all, again, substantial features, about 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and very regular around the foundation. In addition to the brick and mortar, we find lots of stone elements from the church. So one of these would be Purbeck limestone, which is what's in the floor of the church, imported from the Dorset coast of England, although I think that this limestone was reused from Coratoman. So Robert Carter's plantation burns just a few years before this church they start building. So we think they reused the floor stones based on some burn marks, and then doing they've done chemical testing on lead from what's in the floor and like little droplets that fell on it, and then lead from Coratoman, and chemically they're a match. So very cool. And we find little bits and chips of stone. So we think maybe they were trying to resize some of them, trying to get them to fit into a cruciform church shape as opposed to the rectangular shape that Coratoman would have been in. We also have Aquia Creek sandstone, so that's what makes up the detailing on the outside of the church, including this piece was very neat. It was found essentially over by the churchyard wall, so nowhere near the building. And we were able to, it's a piece of one of the windowsills, and we were able to take it from windowsill to windowsill and essentially match it like a puzzle to figure out where it goes. So that was very cool, and it goes to a window, actually right by where we'll go see the excavation afterwards. We also have more tobacco pipes related to this church, and we can tell that these are a little bit more recent pipes because of that bore diameter and some other markers that tell us that they are more recent. And so, for example, like this one we've been calling it the workman's pipe. It has, it's been broken very short, and it also has chew marks around the end. You can kind of see where it narrows as someone was holding it in their mouth. So we're wondering if this could have been like a workman's pipe, like someone who wanted to keep their hands free. They're holding it in their mouth the entire time and leaving those chew marks on this very, very well-loved pipe. So that was it was in I believe it was in one of the construction air layers. So in addition, we have lots of personal items that were likely dropped by people who were worshiping in the church and just coming every Sunday. So for example, we have some sleeve buttons in the shape of seashell rings, so they probably would have adorned a colonial man's shirt. And so that was very cool. My personal favorite artifact we found here has been this, we're calling it a cameo ring. It's not quite the same as a cameo, but it has a wigged man's face looking off to the side. And it has a copper setting with a glass a glass jewel, and that's what the face is impressed in. So you can kind of see it in this photograph. I have it up here. It's very, very, very tiny. It's only about 1 centimeter across. It's either the setting for a ring, or it could be another sleeve button. The backing is broken off, so we can't really tell. But again, also probably colonial era. It was very cool.
What material is that, the two up to the left?
Yeah, so that's it's another copper or copper alloy.
Made of?
Mhm. Yeah, so that's because of that green tint when it oxidizes, it cracks and gets that green. As opposed to iron, gets that green.
It looks like bone, I don't know.
Almost, yeah.
Almost.
Almost, but they're. I have them up here if anyone wanted to see them afterwards. Because, like I said, the ring is like it's tiny. It's very, very cool to see. These are some other rings, jewelry that we found. We're not entirely sure as to the date. They're probably a little bit more recent. So the one on the left is copper with a gold gilt. And we're not really sure. Again, it's broken in multiple places, but it could be in the shape of an urn, which would make it a mourning ring, almost certainly. Or it could be the shape of almost like a heart or some other kind of crown decorative element. And the one on the bottom is a golden ring, has like forget-me-nots around the edges. So that was also very, very cool to find, but not as old, I don't think. As we move into the 19th and 20th century, as I mentioned, we don't have a ton of material from the 19th century, mostly probably because the church was only used intermittently at that point. But from the 1890s and beyond, we have lots and lots of renovation debris. So lots of glass and lots of nails. And I think I went through, so this testing here, this 1 5x5 had, I want to say it was like it was thousands of pieces of glass in this 1 5x5, and it made up 98% of the artifacts that we found. This is one we have cataloged. And so that is held true for around a lot of the foundation. We're going to have a lot of nails and a lot of glass by the time we're done. So, but every once in a while, something really cool pops out of these renovation layers. So for example, this is a portion of the base to Robert Carter's tomb. So there'll be a photo in a little bit, but the tombs had essentially fallen apart by the 1920s. They were essentially piles of rubble, and they had to be rebuilt in 1927. And so apparently this one did not make the cut. It was too degraded, but you can still see that the shape of the molding matches Robert Carter's in the background. And this was found, one of the things they did in the 1890s to 1920s, a lot of the burials, it seems, the coffins had collapsed or the dirt had settled, and it left these low points all throughout the churchyard. And so they went through and took debris, extra soil they had laying around, and smoothed out all these holes, so leveled them off again. And so this was found right by Robert Carter's tomb, but it was over top of the burial of Anne Christopher, who was in the southeast corner over there. So again, not the actual deposition is not super old, but still very cool to see what they were doing around the churchyard in this time. And we have lots more personal items that were dropped by people in this time period as well, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, or not so early 1900s. The one on the left there is a 1980s G.I. Joe backpack. Sent off to my bosses, and they immediately knew what it was. In the middle, we had a doll leg that was found. This is the foot is broken off, but it would have attached like a cloth body. So again, it kind of raised these questions: was this somebody who was visiting? Was it a kid that was dragged to church and brought their toy along? We're not really super sure, but that was kind of interesting. And this was actually found during one of the kids' digs that we had. We had 1 or 2 days where we had school groups come by and help us dig for a short time, and someone pulled out this doll leg. We also have some more jewelry, so it's a screw-back earring on the bottom there, and even more tobacco pipes. So these are the late 19th, early 20th century variety, mostly made here in Pamplin, Virginia. And they would have had a reed as opposed to being all clay like the other pipes we saw. And what's interesting about these is they were only found in one corner of the church in the southwest over here, what I have circled in red. So this kind of also raises more questions about where people are smoking and whether or not it's taboo to be smoking in church. So for example, the 18th century pipes, we kind of have a scattering throughout the churchyard, it seems. They're all over. But these 19th century pipes are really only in this corner And by this time period, the north door on the opposite side would have been the main entrance. So it kind of seems like they were going back behind that to smoke their tobacco pipes at this period. So kind of interesting whether we're looking at like maybe a change over time and whether it was okay to be smoking in church and where you were doing it, whether you're doing it in full sight of everybody or going around back where less people would likely to see you. And he was it was the only one in that row. So the reason, so these blue lines are the drain lines we excavated. We stuck really close to the sidewalks if we could in hopes that it would help us avoid the burials. Because in theory, they wouldn't be that close. And it almost worked except for this one individual who was much closer than all the rest. And so in the photo on the right, you can kind of see the outline of the coffin. He was buried in a wooden coffin. We also found lots of nails where if we didn't have any wood that was left, we could see where it was based on the pattern of the nails. And he was, I say he because a lot of the clothing identifiers that we found would indicate adult male essentially. So he had a row of buttons going up like a shirt, and there were several as well about where the wrists would be. So sleeve buttons again, as well as a pattern right along the waist that indicates breeches probably. So whoever this individual was, they were buried with a fair amount of clothing.
But the fabric is gone, right? It's just
yes,
the
yeah, sorry, yeah. This is just an
and the
example.
hardware, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from probably about the same time period, we think. Just kind of showing that arrangement of buttons in such a way would suggest breeches, so they had like this kind of flap in the front as well. But we didn't find any down by the ankles, which is could have had fabric buttons. And unfortunately, the preservation of the bones themselves were very poor. They had been sent off for osteological analysis to try to learn a little bit more about this individual before they were reburied. So we're hoping to hear back. We're also hoping to do some ancient DNA testing, again, to help learn a little bit more about this individual. But ultimately, they will be reinterred within the churchyard. So we'll be doing more archaeology to find a spot that's suitable. So just kind of summarizing everything. So we have the Native American component, mostly identified through the ceramics, and that indicates an occupation for people that were here pretty much up until the contact period. Which is kind of interesting, like right on the spot. It's one of those things that there wasn't a lot of documentation, there's no written record, and if there was a written record from the English colonists, then it could always be very biased. So having the archaeology kind of helps add to that story. We have raised more questions about the first church location. We really haven't identified any definitive post holes or anything yet, or anything that we feel comfortable saying, this is definitely the first church, but we've definitely found pieces of it in the form of that window glass and the tile and the early tobacco pipes, and also artifacts that were dropped by the people who were using this church and building this church. And then we can also talk about the current church, lots of activities that were happening in the yard, where these activities were taking place, and what that says about what was taboo versus acceptable at the time. We can talk about what kind of clothing and what objects people are bringing to church, what they're wearing, things like toys that are dropped by kids. We can talk about conveying a message through the architecture and the landscape, so having all these different kinds of delineations around the churchyard. For example, like that western boundary for the first churchyard. The fact that they chose to fill in that substantial ditch and build a whole new wall instead, I think kind of conveys a message that Robert Carter wanted to, probably he wanted to show off his wealth a little bit by building this brand new brickyard, and also this building being such a fabulous Georgian building has a certain look that goes along to the landscape. All very ordered, very symmetrical, and so I think conveying that kind of message is something that we can talk about with the archaeology. And then also changes in how the space is treated over time, how it goes from being a church to not used nearly as much, to being maybe a church again for a little bit, and then finally a museum space. And so all of that kind of leaves evidence through the archaeology, which is very interesting. And then finally, I want to talk about like the fact that we've had, you guys being such a museum and educational space, we've been able to have kids digs where local school groups have come out. Either we've talked to them or they've helped us dig for a little bit. We've been able to share some of our findings through things like the Raise the Roof Beer Fest, and we've had our own interns who have gotten a chance to come out and help us dig a little bit. So it's just been a really great opportunity to really share some of this history and hopefully get some people excited about it. So, yeah, that's my talk. So, thank you.